classified. You'll reach thousands of shoppers who check our listings every day. Are you a business looking to get a corner on the internet marketplace? USA for Sale can help you reach your target audience in Ocala, the Villages, and statewide. There's no better place to reach shoppers than right where they shop. Let us show you how. Learn more by calling 352-629-1663 or visit us online at usaforsale.com.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
All right, 6 minutes after 11 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. I could never work in one of those places where they test things on animals. I just couldn't do it. I'd have to say, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to work somewhere else. So anyway, our next guest is Dr. Katherine Rowe. She is a research associate with the Laboratory Investigations Department for People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. You know them better by their acronym of P.E.T.A. Mm-hmm. And one of the things she's going to talk to us about is forced swim tests, which I had never heard of this, so I Googled it real quickly. And what came up was another set of words, behavioral despair test. And under that it says the behavioral despair test is a test centered on a rodent's response to the threat of drowning. Oh, see, that's what I mean. I couldn't do that.
No.
I don't know how they do that. Dr. Katherine Rowe, good morning. Thank you for being on the show with us today.
Good morning. Thank you for having me today.
And where are you today?
I am based in South Carolina, so not that far from you guys at all.
Are you getting rain?
Not right now. It's pretty hot and humid, but no rain.
So, did the Google search do me right? Is that what a forced swim test is? Is that other thing?
The Google search did you just right. The forced swim test is an absolutely horribly cruel, outdated, and useless experiment where small animals, that includes mice, rats, hamsters, gerbils, are forced into inescapable tanks of water where they have to paddle furiously in order to keep from drowning. And this test used to be called, as you found out, the despair test.
Okay, so now I was looking at this. I've never seen this test, and the only thing I've ever seen was that one photo that Google put on there. And I'm thinking to myself, how is it possible that we don't already know or can predict? I never have drowned. Well, I actually did drown a rat one time. Mm-hmm. But I'll tell you about that in a second. Hope you don't hate me. But but I mean, if I tried to imagine what would happen, and I better explain how I drowned a rat. But if I tried to imagine what would happen, I think I'd get it right, wouldn't I?
Yes, and the idea when the test was originally designed, which was 50 years ago, was that if you placed an animal in a situation where they were experiencing unpredictable fear and stress, you could somehow induce depression in a way that's similar to humans. But now we know, of course, that what's happening to these animals in these tanks has no relevance to human depression. It cannot help us understand human depression, and it can't help us develop new treatments.
But they still do it.
But they're still doing it, and that's what I'm here to talk to you and your listeners about. P.E.T.A. has actually obtained videos.
Operator, can you hear me?
Yeah.
From the National Institute of Mental Health, where you can, which you can see at P.E.T.A.org. And what you'll see are mice being subjected to the forced swim test, as well as other horrible tests like the tail suspension test, where mice are hung upside down by their tails, and foot shock tests where they're repeatedly shocked electrically. And we know now that these tests are not going to help us understand human depression, and yet the National Institute of Mental Health is still conducting these experiments and using taxpayer money to conduct these experiments. And we're hoping that listeners will go to P.E.T.A.org and ask the National Institute of Mental Health to end these experiments.
I can't even imagine what their side of the story would be. As a radio host, Robin and I, we try to. Well, what's the other side? Let me try to imagine, because I can't imagine. Maybe you can fill in the blanks. We do this so that people will be better off. That's the only argument I can hear in my imagination. Do you have any way of being the devil's advocate just for a moment?
Well, what's even more frustrating is that the director of the National Institute of Mental Health himself has acknowledged that these tests are not a good measure of depression and has even referred to them as a waste of money. And yet in 2018 alone, the National Institute of Mental Health spent $18 million on these experiments.
And do the rats and the mice die in these tests? Are they actually killed?
They're often killed after they're removed from the tanks or removed from having their tails suspended. Some of the mice do drown in the tank, which is, obviously horrible.
Okay, if I were to ask them, maybe I'm going to ask you so that you can try to answer the way they would, but how does drowning a rat tell you anything about depression? Would anybody in a drowning situation would be depressed or stressed out or something?
Sure.
Right?
Right. Well, what the original protocol was to measure how much time the animals would spend frantically swimming and climbing and trying to get out of the beakers versus just floating. And the idea then was that, well, if an animal stops swimming and starts floating, they're quote-unquote depressed. But, of course, now we know so much more about animal behavior, and people realize that what the animals are likely doing when they're floating is conserving their energy. It's a survival strategy. It is not an indication that they're experiencing depression.
But again, they're doing this to try to figure out how people tick. And all I have to do is imagine myself in a big barrel and somebody's pouring water in there, and somebody says, wait a minute, you're floating. You must be depressed. And I would say, of course I'm depressed. You're trying to drown me.
Yeah.
Right? I can't even understand how this helps understand human behavior.
It doesn't. And that's the reason that we're so concerned that these experiments are still being conducted. This is money that could be much better spent on the much more humane and much more human-relevant research methods that are available and are already in use and are already helping us understand depression and develop new treatments for depression.
And to me, when a person is diagnosed with depression, the doctor that diagnoses that depression, I thought they would do some kind of history on that person to try to pinpoint why that particular person was depressed. I mean, if one person is depressed and another person is depressed, the circumstances leading up to that are not the same.
Well, I think you're exactly right, and I think it's a really important point. Human depression is really complex. The causes, both genetic and environmental, are complex, and they differ from person to person. The symptoms of depression differ from person to person, and the responsivity to treatment differs from person to person. So trying to recreate this in a mouse or a hamster in a lab is absurd, and to do it by forcing them into tanks of water or hanging them up by their tails is just cruel.
Right. Doctor, I have a question for you about legislation that was recently, I think it was either proposed, I don't think it passed yet, but it was to make cruelty to animals a federal offense. What are your thoughts on that is part A, and part B is would that affect the testing that we're talking about?
Well, I think that cruelty to animals should be a federal offense. And what's interesting is that a lot of what goes on in laboratories is excused from that sort of legislation. So the things that people do to animals in laboratories, if somebody did that in their backyard to an animal in an alley, they would be arrested. It is a crime. But the fact that it's covered under the heading of research makes it legal. And so it would be fantastic if any of these sorts of cruel behaviors towards animals whether they happened in a laboratory or they happened in somebody's home, would be illegal, because what's happening to those animals should be a crime.
Now, are some of these businesses that are doing these experiments, are they recipients of government grants?
Well, what the National Institute of Mental Health funds is taxpayer money, so that is government funding. We do know that Pfizer, Eli Lilly, and Bristol Myers Squibb are pharmaceutical companies that are also using the forced swim test. The good news is that after speaking with P.E.T.A and reviewing the scientific data, several pharmaceutical companies have banned the use of the forced swim test. And that includes Johnson & Johnson, AbbVie, Roche, AstraZeneca. So we're hoping that these pharmaceutical companies that are still conducting this test will stop and join the others in banning this useless and cruel test.
Dr. Katherine Rowe is our guest, and we're talking about the forced swim tests on animals at the National Institute of Mental Health, and you're making a really good case for why we should say something about it. The website for PETA, PETA.org, does it have like links and videos and explanations so that we can look into this further?
It does. So what listeners can do is go to PETA.org, where they can see these experiments for themselves, and I think that they will be horrified and understand why we're so concerned about them. But they can also, in just a couple of clicks, send an email to the National Institute of Mental Health, as well as to Pfizer, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Eli Lilly, and ask them to stop wasting resources and stop harming animals with these cruel experiments.
Because a lot of the companies, they have different kinds of medications, and they put out the call for different people to volunteer for their control groups. And I don't see how something like this could really be beneficial, because it's it's just absurd.
Well, what's frustrating is that a lot of pharmaceutical companies have stopped even trying to develop new drugs for neuropsychiatric illnesses because they fail at such a high rate. And the reason that they fail at such a high rate is believed to be because the preclinical work is done in non-human animals. So the fact that we're continuing to conduct these cruel experiments on animals not only harms animals, but it harms people who are still waiting for new and more effective treatments.
And the only thing that these particular animals go through is the drowning process. Not that that's a little thing, but they don't get subjected to chemical injections and things like that, or do they?
A lot of these animals are subjected to a number of things.
Oh, really?
Remember that they're often trying to test the effectiveness of a new antidepressant using the forced swim test.
Oh, okay.
They are sometimes injected with chemicals. Now, here's the crazy thing. The likelihood that a drug that seemed to change the swimming behavior in a mouse would somehow affect depression in a human is the same as a coin toss. It's at chance.
Yeah, I bet it is.
That's how ineffective this test is.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So how can the scientists that are working at the National Institute of Mental Health, how can they keep turning a blind eye to all of the cruelty?
You know, I think that's a great question, and one that I wish I had a good answer, because I don't understand it myself. I think as long as the grant money for these experiments is still sent out, people will still conduct these experiments, even though they know they're not getting anywhere using these tests. And the truth is, there are so many better ways to understand human depression. You know, there are so many neuroimaging technologies available where we can look at the human brain in depth. There are computer simulations that can help us understand the mechanisms behind depression and help predict the effectiveness of an antidepressant for an individual. And now they can make three-dimensional models of the human brain using cells from individuals with depression, and look and see how their individual genetic makeup, their environmental history affects their brain and help them predict how an antidepressant might help them. And these are much better ways to help us understand depression and help us get new treatments for depression, which we need.
If you read the information that is posted on the NCBI website, I just kind of Googled this. I don't even know what I'm looking at, but it justifies it, and it's so propaganda-ish. Oh my gosh! If you read this, it's like, well, this is why we do it and how we do it, and oh my gosh! But then there's another article that indicates that there is, in this day and age, intelligent. What do you call it again?
Intelligent design.
No, intelligent. What is that?
Artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence that can do the same thing. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
It says here there's a cost-effective software solution for all behavioral tests. So we don't even need it anymore.
That's exactly my point. Is these are cool. There are better ways, more cost-effective ways, and more clinically relevant ways for us to study depression. And so continuing to waste money and resources harming animals with these sorts of experiments is ridiculous. There's no justification for it.
It doesn't even seem to make sense to me, because I don't think a rodent is going to behave the same way as a human.
No.
I mean, they're not going to think, if they think they're dying, are they thinking to themselves, oh my gosh, who's going to pay the mortgage if I die? Oh my gosh, what's going to happen to the kids? Oh my gosh,
Right.
They're not thinking that. They're just thinking, I got to stay alive. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
There's so much else that goes on in our human minds.
Right. Our lives are very different, and our physiology is very different. The way that the brain works in a rodent and the way that the brain works in a human are not the same.
And to me, it seems that if they stop paddling and just start to float, that they figure in their own mind there is no way out, so they're just going to give up and commit suicide.
Well, I think for most of these animals, when they float, it's because they realize that this is a better way to conserve energy. Because floating is definitely a more cost-efficient way to get through the trials. And the people who do these experiments have found that the amount of experience an animal has nearly drowning in the tank affects how quickly they may decide to float. Where they realize, oh, this is actually a good way. The experimenter will please take me out of this tank, or I'm not going to waste all of my energy trying to climb out of this beaker when it's better to just do the back float,
Mm-hmm.
like your swimming teacher taught you when you were in swimming lessons.
Tell me some of the other work you do at the Laboratory Investigations Department.
Well, my job primarily is to work on experiments like the forced swim test, which we know have no relevance to human health. We know are incredibly cruel to animals, and we know there are much better, easily accessible alternatives for researchers to use. And so we reach out to scientists, to funding agencies, to pharmaceutical companies, and explain our concerns about the ethics of conducting these sorts of experiments on animals, explain our concerns about the science of these experiments, or the lack of science in these experiments, and also present the information about the alternatives. You would be surprised at how many scientists don't know that there are more modern tools available and accessible to them.
Oh, really?
I think like anybody, scientists can get caught up in like a rut.
Right.
They've been doing the same series of tests over and over again. They get funded, and they keep doing what they're comfortable with, when the truth is science demands that scientists are constantly updating their tools based on the most updated information about the relevance of the tools and about the diseases they're trying to study.
And do you think the families of the people that have been diagnosed with these with depression and other conditions, that they're aware of these kind of tests? And if they are, why don't they take a stand against it?
Well, we try to make as many people informed about this sort of thing as possible, and that's why it's great that radio stations like you guys are willing to give us a voice and let their listeners hear about what kind of things their money is being spent on, and let them know that the treatments that they're waiting for, the money is not being spent in the most effective way. But I do think that, individuals with conditions that need new treatments, or family members of individuals with conditions that need new treatments, get very frustrated when they see how some of the money that's dedicated towards research is being wasted.
Well, Doctor, thank you for the work that you do, and you're making the world a better place, and it's probably one of the hardest things to do is to get people to change the way they think they need to do things when animals are concerned, and I think it's just a good thing, and I'm glad you're sharing it with us, but I did promise I would tell you why I drowned a rat one time.
Oh yes.
So I don't want you to hate me, but I had some rats in my garage, and they were chewing everything, and I did everything I could to chase them out. I even let the cat live in there, and the cat was afraid of them. So I had no choice. I went to the whatever you call that place that sells rat traps, and I got one, right? And I set it up, and at that time my son was still little, and I must have been out of the garage maybe 10 minutes, and I heard a snap. And I said, oh my gosh, I think we got one. And this is not a mouse. This is a rat, a big trap. And the poor guy, the rat, was alive, but his neck was broken. And I thought, oh my gosh, I know. And I didn't want to euthanize him with a shovel, so I thought I'll just put him in a bucket of water. So that's what I did. So that's how I ended up drowning a rat.
No.
I know, I hate it.
Just so you know, I know, just so you know, in case the situation comes up again, there are humane traps, even for animals as big as rats, that don't kill the animal, but that you can contain the animal temporarily and then bring them out of your house and into a more suitable environment for them to live.
Thank you for sharing that, because listeners who didn't, I already know that, and I told Robin at the time, I said, I am never doing this again.
Yeah.
If there's a rat, I'm going to figure out.
I think that's what happens.
Because I felt horrible.
People realize, that's they realize what's happened, and they didn't mean it, but it just happened. So it's always good to tell people in advance that there are humane ways to, if they need to get a mouse or a rat or a raccoon or something out of there.
We had a story
do it without killing them.
We had a story in our local news about a bunch of bats being in the roof of one of our schools, and it's against the law to kill bats here. So they had to get a specialist to get like 1,000 bats out of the roof.
Yeah, they did. It was amazing.
Oh, that's great.
Out of the attic. Yeah, and they got them out without killing them. So, and you're right, there is a way to do it humanely, and so that's, I have to, I guess, face that music when I die.
God won't mind. I don't think
he's going to say, I got something I need to ask you about. There was a rat in your garage? Oh,
well, you're doing wonderful, wonderful work. I mean, gosh,
Thank you so much.
And all your other work, you protected barn owls, you've protected testing on dogs at Texas A&M University, gosh, and protecting the monkeys and even the birds, and you're really doing wonderful work.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you saying so.
The website is PETA.org, simple as that, PETA.org. Dr. Katherine Rowe, thank you. Catherine? Doctor? She went away?
I guess so.
All right, we'll be right back. This is The Source, WOCA Ocala.
Broadcasting from the P.E.T.A Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages,
Fox News. I'm Chris Foster.
FM,
Members of the House have been debating a package of rules set up by the Democrats for the impeachment process. Oklahoma Republicans